Well, the perception of Lukashenko and Lukashenko's Belarus indeed has changed. Let's say in the year 2014, 2015, in the context of the Russian-Western crisis over Ukraine, the major reason was that the West thought that it would be better to re-engage with Lukashenko, provide Belarus with an extra opportunity to maybe distance a little bit from Russia. So the normalization of the Western Belarusian relations has indeed taken place. It's impossible to count the number of Western visits to Minsk. It's impossible to count the number of international events hosted by Minsk. But this is not the whole story. This is only the appearance of the story. The reality is that the West was not able to go beyond normalization. It doesn't know what kind of policy to conduct towards Belarus. This is certainly not a policy of democracy promotion, because then the West would have to pay much more attention to the continuing repressions. But this is certainly not a policy of just pure and simple geopolitically based re-engagement, because then the Western offer would have to be much bigger. And the problem is that trust is still completely absent from this relationship. In the West, there is an institutional memory of the failure of the previous attempts to establish cooperation, especially the period of 2008-2010, which ended disastrously. And in Belarus, or in Minsk, there is a reciprocal fear that actually what the West is up to is the regime change. That if kind of the policy of inner liberalization starts, then sooner or later the West will still support a kind of Euro-Maidan movement in Belarus. And for as long as the trust is absent, the West has a very cautious attitude. The big money is not coming. Even small concessions are not being really made. I can only give the example of the visa liberalization for the Belarusian citizens, which has not been granted in exchange for the actually visa-free travel opportunity offered to the Western citizens by Minsk. Lukashenko is handshakes worthy in the West. He's certainly not the last dictator of Europe anymore, especially since there is Mr. Putin next door. But this is certainly not yet a cooperative and productive relationship, as the architects of the re-engagement would have hoped 4 or 5 years ago. Well, I'd say that the leash has only become shorter, because again, there is a lot less trust in the Russian-Belarusian relationship at the moment. Several years ago, Russia publicly proposed to Belarus to allow an Air Force base in Belarus, and the answer was no. And as many commentators interpreted that fact, the reason behind that proposal was not that Russia wanted or needed a base on the Belarusian territory. Actually not, because it would not change the geostrategic situation that much. But it was a kind of a test offered to Mr. Lukashenko to show how much of a reliable, trustworthy ally to Russia he was, and he failed that test. That showed to Russia that Lukashenko is indeed trying to have a policy of balancing, maybe distancing a little bit, and Russia started to tighten the screws. And objectively, the situation is not very promising for Minsk, because its economic dependence on Russia is actually growing, but Russia is a lot less generous. The loans and the grants, they still come, but they're much smaller than before. They're not enough if measured against the objective need for Belarus, even in terms of refinancing its debts. So Belarus actually has to borrow more on commercial markets these days, maybe it's same Russian commercial markets, but still this is not the amount of economic assistance that it has been used to. And that means that every time when Lukashenko and Putin have negotiations, probably Lukashenko has to offer something in return, which is not that simple. And that's why the outcome of every next round of negotiations is becoming less and less transparent. Actually, we don't know what Lukashenko concedes every time he meets with Putin. Probably some concessions on Ukraine are made. So the economic dependence is growing. Russia has only also started building its own military infrastructure on the Belarusian borders, which is something new, which is again can be interpreted as a signal also targeted at Minsk and sent to Minsk. And if before Lukashenko could say to the Russians that you don't have anything in the West but the Belarusian army, which kind of was intended to show the importance of Belarus for Russia, it's no longer the case. Third, Russian media are conducting a very, very active policy aimed at the Russian-speaking and pro-Russian community in Belarus. They're fostering this community, they're fostering the Russian world, they're preventing the emergence or strengthening of the national Belarusian identity. And this is something which is clearly a concern for the Belarusian leadership. Fourth, there's been a personnel change. Russia has now a new ambassador in Minsk, a former career KGB officer, Mikhail Babic, the person who was the prime minister of Chechnya at some point, and the person who was proposed to Ukraine as an ambassador to Ukraine, and Ukraine immediately rejected that proposal. He was not given an agreement. This is a person who is now sitting in Minsk, and he's making, unlike his predecessor, he's making very serious statements, again aimed at a larger community in Belarus, and the thinking in the expert community is that he is there to have an oversight of the Belarusian governing, administrative and security elites. And fifth, the Russian Orthodox Church, in the context of the Ukrainian developments in Ukraine, has become more active in Belarus, and recently they organized a gathering of the Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church in Minsk, first time in history. And again, that was a reminder to everybody, including the Belarusian authorities, that there is a powerful structure acting inside Belarus, which is actually not subordinate to the state government at all. So my argument would be that Russia was a little bit worried when the process of rapprochement in Belarus and the West started, but it has taken its measures, and it's continuing the policy aimed at making sure that actually Belarus's freedom of maneuver will not increase, it will rather shrink, and whoever is in charge in Belarus, being Lukashenko, being his hypothetical successor, the structural influence of Russia inside Belarus will be sufficient to prevent it from really going west.